Welcome to CodaZero Earth. My name is Kate Charlesworth. I'm in Sydney in Australia, and together with my colleague Forbes McGain in Melbourne, we will be co-hosting today's episode. Firstly, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet and to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Wherever you are in the world today, we ask that you also take a moment to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which you stand. Today we are proud to collaborate with Teleflex, who are supporting this educational event. Teleflex are passionate advocates for advancing the cause of sustainable healthcare and corporate social responsibility in the medical device industry. When the Coda community was surveyed last year, the climate emergency was voted the #1 issue. Health professionals are alarmed for our patients and for our children. And we're right to be worried. There is now overwhelming scientific evidence that the climate crisis will be potentially catastrophic for human health. Okay? Not just through extreme weather events, air pollution and mental health impacts, but through the indirect health impacts related to food and water insecurity, mass migration and civil conflict. The Lancet Commission has said that the climate emergency threatens to undo the last 50 years in mental health, in public health gains, and to destabilise health systems globally. Okay. And whilst many national governments are asleep at the wheel, there is now a rapidly growing international groundswell of states and countries, industries, businesses and civil society who are waking up to the climate emergency and taking decisive and unprecedented action. Sadly, the health profession, which is supposed to be so good at emergencies, has, in many countries, been largely missing in action. Why is that? And more importantly, what can we do now? Well, there's a huge amount that we can do. There are more than 60 million healthcare workers globally. We are well educated and informed and well connected. And health is our core responsibility. If we act together, we could make a huge difference for our patients and for our children. Today we have a stellar panel lined up to explore this issue and to put together a prescription for action. To introduce them, I'll hand over to your co-host, Forbes McGain.
Hello, my name is Forbes McGain. I'm an intensive care physician and anaesthetist in Melbourne. I'd just like to say Kate is a public health physician in Sydney, and I'm delighted to introduce your 4 panellists today. You'll see next to Kate there is Tim Flannery, an internationally acclaimed scientist, explorer, conservationist and writer who was Australian of the Year in 2007. He currently holds a number of roles, including Chief Counsellor at the Climate Council. Omnia El Omrani is a medical student based in Cairo in Egypt, and currently the Liaison Officer Public Health issues at the International Federation of Medical Students Associations. Michelle Fox is from Boston in the United States, a critical care nurse and the Corporate Vice President and Chief Medical Officer for the global medical technology company Teleflex. And Courtney Howard is an emergency physician in Yellowknife, I think about 60 degrees north in Canada's subarctic. Past president of the Canadian Association for Physicians of the Environment and on the WHO Civil Working Society Group on Climate Change and Health. Kate, if you'd like to take us on to conversation 1, I would say that our overall aim here is to convey the urgency and seriousness of the situation of climate change and health, giving examples of success over the time. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of each conversation that we have, and myself and Kate will be coordinating those questions as they arrive. Thank you.
Okay, so our first conversation is about the climate health emergency. Tim Flannery, there is now overwhelming evidence that we are at the start of a climate breakdown and a 6th mass extinction. How bad is it?
Well, look, Kate, the truth is that we're now entering a phase of rapid acceleration of threat. And that threat ranges from sea level rise to extreme weather events to the downstream health impacts and things like bushfires. And just one example that's still very raw for me is the Australian bushfires of this last summer. Yeah, we had 2 years in a row driest records over southeastern Australia ever, and then the hottest year in Australia ever. And the bushfire kind of volume went from about 2%, the worst case previously was about 2% of the forest burning, to 21% of the forest burning. And the downstream impacts of that were massive. We had huge problems with smoke inhalation, we had a number of people killed in the fires, and of course, huge biodiversity impacts. Now that's happening at an average global temperature of about just over 1 degree Celsius. That's the increase that we've experienced. Here in Australia, we're already at 1.5 degrees above the pre-industrial average, just because it's a flat continent in the tropics. The situation is going to really start getting worse, unfortunately, because we are committed to an outcome a bit like the pandemic. You know how the figures we see with COVID today result from events that occurred at some time in the past, maybe the last 2 weeks, you know. Climate change is the same. The CO2 that is causing the warming doesn't reach its full warming potential for several decades, so it pre-commits us to a worse outcome. And my big fear is that we won't act before we start hitting the tipping points where the climate system really takes over and you get positive feedback loops that then make action ineffective. So this is the moment of crisis, really. This is the moment to act.
How long have we got then?
Oh, look, I think it's a matter of years. We're approaching the point where we're absolutely committed to 1.5 degrees of warming. Within the next decade, we'll be committed to 2 degrees of warming, and if we hit that, then it's fairly certain we'll start crossing these thresholds. So we have to actually, this is the moment to act and start cutting that risk as fast as we can by cutting fossil fuel use.
Okay, thank you. Courtney Howard, you're an emergency doctor. Is this an emergency, and what are the issues for health?
Absolutely. When you think about how we manage clinical illness in the emerge, we have time windows for action, and we know that time is heart, time is, in this case, time is planet. So we have 2 sprints. We have an adaptation sprint that we need to undertake to manage the warming we're already committed to, as Tim has said. So that means we need to make sure that our operating rooms have great ventilation systems to cope with wildfire smoke, et cetera. And then we need to prevent what we can't cope with. And so when we think about what Tim has said and their health corollaries, wildfires equal trauma, evacuation, PTSD, huge clouds of smoke that have been shown increasingly to increase overall mortality, heat emergencies, heat stress, heat stroke, longer and more severe pollen seasons make for worsened hay fever. We're seeing severe weather events, which cause trauma, evacuation, contaminate water supplies. All of this means that our crops are more unreliable, and we're seeing decreasing food yields worldwide, which leads to increased malnutrition. And all of this, you can imagine, if your kid doesn't have food, and as a parent, you do almost anything to get your kid food, you may need to move to another place. So that's the migration that Tim is speaking of. So as a humanitarian working with Doctors Without Borders, all of the psychosocial and sequelae of refugee work, and then conflict, which we know is horrible for health. And what's really important for us to recognize as healthcare professionals is our healthcare systems depend on functioning borders and a functioning global society. And so not only does this put health at risk, it puts functioning healthcare systems at risk as well.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. I mean, Tim, if I could come back to you, I think there's a huge frustration in the health profession, because if doctors fail to act on this level of evidence in our medical practice, we would be negligent and we'd be in danger of losing our medical registration. Yeah. And yet leaders and governments seem to get away with dismissing and failing to act on overwhelming scientific evidence. How has this been, how and why has there been this sort of campaign of misinformation, and where does that leave us now?
Well, look, the sad truth, Kate, is that we've known for many decades now what the outcome would be if we don't cut fossil fuels. And the key work done in this area was initially done by ExxonMobil, a big oil company in the early 1980s that did the climate projections. They paid for climate scientists to do the work. They projected where we'd be by 2020, and lo and behold, we're here. And that projection was based on the premise that there would be no effective action to limit fossil fuel use, which was their objective. That was their business, is to produce fossil fuels and to see it burned. I guess some of the people who did that believed it was a long way off, or maybe they believed they could go into some gated community and isolate themselves and their children from the impacts. But that's just not the nature of the world we live in. We are all interconnected, and these consequences are now very severe. You also see, as part of a long-term penetration of our government, that there are government ministers here and elsewhere who will serve in the resources portfolio or energy portfolio and then retire and go onto the board of a fossil fuel company. So the links have been there all along. We have people in the Australian Parliament who own coal mines. You know, we have lobbyists who write the rule, or people who write the rules that, for government on fossil fuels and so forth, who started as lobbyists in the fossil fuel industry and then go back to the fossil fuel industry when they've done their stint in government. It's the system is just intermeshed in a way where power, wealth and influence are all skewed against us and trying to understand how urgent this threat is and to take action, because it threatens the immediate wealth of a few.
Mm-hmm. So, Courtney, for us, for health professionals, this is a pretty familiar story because, of course, it's well documented now that the tactics used by the fossil fuel industry, discrediting scientists, obfuscation, intense political lobbying, are precisely the same tactics that were used for decades by the tobacco industry. And as Tim has said, they are powerful, they are well-funded and well connected, and they have been very successful in delaying an appropriate response to the climate crisis. And yet, on our side, we have that health professionals are the most trusted and the most respected professional group in society. How can we use that influence to lead action?
Yeah, great question. So something that's really worthwhile knowing is that according to research done by Ed Maybach and others, presenting climate change as a health threat is actually the best way to motivate action across the political spectrum. However, because this hasn't been in curricula, we haven't been teaching politicians what they actually need to know. So they actually don't know the bottom lines. I briefed the federal health minister here in Canada and watched the penny drop. We watched her go, oh, this isn't about a slightly warmer world. This is about wildfires, evacuation, and potential systemic collapse. That is our job. Here in Canada, there was a survey of lobbying at the federal level that showed that basically the ministers and staff were getting lobbied 5 times as much by the fossil fuel industry as by non-governmental actors. We can change that. Basically are the best messengers for the most effective message to help people understand, which will help both from adaptation and mitigation. And what's great is that most of the measures, or a lot of the measures that decrease fossil fuel use, also decrease air pollution. We know that the WHO says that we're losing about 7 million people worldwide every year to air pollution. So if we move to electric vehicles that are made with clean energy, in Canada, for instance, we lose 1,000 people every year, as far as we can tell, from air pollution related to transport. So there's real-time health co-benefits to a lot of this work that not only improve health, but save healthcare dollars right now. So the more we can communicate both the health problems and the health benefits of climate action, or the health problems associated with inaction and the benefits of action, the more effective our messaging will be.
Yeah, no, certainly the co-benefits argument also is, is a very effective one here. I just wanted to turn to gas because it's such a big issue here in Australia, and I know also in Canada, Courtney, and I will come on to you. But what we're seeing here at the moment, to continue with this theme, is the gas industry now trying to position itself as a transition fuel or as a clean fuel, when there's emerging evidence to show that when you take into account fugitive methane emissions, it's just as polluting as coal. Tim, if I could ask you, what is the true situation about gas and what can we do?
Sure. Well, look, in Australia, the gas industry's gone from almost nowhere a decade or two ago to today, where we're one of the largest exporters on the planet, along with coal. And there's an $80 billion investment being made in that gas infrastructure, and people want to see that pay off. So we're seeing now a huge lobbying effort, I think, to encourage government to spend my tax dollars and every other Australian tax dollars on projects to benefit gas. But the truth of the matter is we don't need gas as a transition fuel now. We might need to continue using a small amount. But in states like South Australia, which are most advanced in terms of the energy transition, they don't have any more coal, they've got lots of renewables. There, the amount of gas being burnt over the last decade's actually gone down a little bit and is projected to go down further. So it's not like there's a gas boom on. We'll need a little bit of gas to make the transition, but it's a short-term limited thing. And to see governments talking about spending billions of dollars for transcontinental pipelines and so forth, you realise how desperate the situation is. And we just must actually cut all fossil fuels. Gas is a very polluting fossil fuel. We simply cannot afford to have it in the mix long term. Otherwise, we will forfeit our future.
Courtney, what's the gas situation in Canada and how are health professionals responding?
It's very similar to what Tim just described in Australia. And what's important to note is that our governments are in many cases subsidizing this work. So for instance, the biggest liquefied natural gas plant in British Columbia is requiring huge subsidies from both the government of British Columbia and the government of Canada. That's our money. And so what's really important, we need to reframe this. So they've basically gotten away with calling it natural gas, which sounds amazing. I picture like a swoopy Ken doll natural gas. In fact, it's a super pollutant. And so we need to reframe methane as a super pollutant. I thought about getting my kids to dress up as Darth Vapor for Halloween. We need that level of visual messaging across the world to reframe gas as the super pollutant that it is. Important to know, it often comes from fracking. And we haven't done the studies we need to do to determine the local health impacts of fracking. It's one of those situations where there's not enough studies, there's red flags in the ones that have been done. And when we go looking, we're gonna find big problems. So get rid of gas, stop the fracking, let's move straight to renewables.
Okay, thanks, Courtney. Forbes, I'll hand over to you now. I see some audience questions. I see we've sort of dealt with some of the questions relating to gas, but Forbes, some other questions for the panelists?
Yeah, so there's a few trickling through. Thank you, team. And thanks to everyone who's sending questions. Please pop them in now. I think there's an important question there, particularly about the gas towards the end. It's, and I might, Omnia, perhaps if you're able to respond, maybe you could tell us in Egypt, for example, I don't actually know what the source of energy for Egypt mainly is. Is it perhaps oil-based or is it gas? And how does this seem to you, to perhaps nations like Egypt, which are obviously needing energy, and this whole discussion you've just heard about gas, for example, how does that fit in?
Yes, that is very interesting because I come from a slightly different perspective. In Egypt, we are a combination of both oil and natural gas based. But again, we really we find it very difficult to invest in renewable energy because of how expensive it is, and our economy is really restarting since the turmoils that we've had before. However, we have new initiatives being set in Egypt and a huge vision for the next 10 years. And they're really prioritizing investing in solar energy. And Egypt really wants to champion itself as one of the countries in the Middle East region that had done that transition. So this is kind of I think an inspiring way to motivate countries to try to, champion themselves by transitioning into renewable energy. And especially in Egypt, we have the best resource and very sustainable source, especially for solar energy. And we're even applying that in our own healthcare facilities as well as the airport railways.
Thank you very much, Omnia. Michelle, perhaps a comment of what's happening in the US there at the moment. I understand there might be an election there soon, but certainly it's sort of exciting times, I think.
It certainly is, and definitely there is an unprecedented early turnout to vote. And a lot of the focus of voters, certainly here in the US, is on the environment, particularly with the wildfires we're seeing on the West Coast throughout California. It is top of mind here.
Thank you. Kate, we could probably move to the next section.
Sure. Just to finish up on thanks Forbes. Just to finish up on this one, a question for you, Tim. How much do we actually contribute to the climate crisis here in Australia, and where are we tracking as a nation? Because I think there's a fair bit of misconceptions about that.
Yeah, look, per capita, we're one of the largest polluters on the planet. Overall, we produce about 1.4% of the total pollution, and that's used as an excuse for inaction. But during the Second World War, Australian troops made up about 1.4% of the Allied forces. And if the Prime Minister had said, well, we're only 1.4% of the Allied forces, it doesn't make any difference if we try a bit harder, he'd be accused of treason. And it's the same thing. Yes, we're 1.4%, but we're a very important 1.4%, and we need to do our best to reduce our impact so others will follow our lead.
Yeah, I certainly noticed, like watching something like Fight for Planet A on the ABC, the huge amount of surprise from so many people that we're actually one of the highest per capita emitters in the world, because that's certainly
Indeed.
not what is portrayed by the government. Okay, thanks. I think we'll move on to conversation 2 then. Thank you. Which is about climate change as an issue of social injustice and health inequity. So climate change is affecting all of us. As Tim mentioned, just look at Australia's Black Summer. But we know that it's the most vulnerable who are being hit the first and the hardest. It's children, it's the elderly, it's poorer communities, Indigenous groups and so on. So climate change is not just a threat multiplier, but a vulnerability multiplier and an inequity multiplier. Omnia, you're a medical student in Cairo and also an advocate within the International Federation of Medical Students. And so you're hearing from medical students all around the world. What are the biggest issues in Egypt and also from your fellow students in other countries?
Yeah, so from my perspective as a medical student currently working in my teaching hospital in Cairo, so Cairo is one of the biggest cities in Egypt with the highest rate of air pollution. I see patients every day suffering from chronic diseases, especially respiratory ones, including asthma, most of them exacerbated by air pollution. These patients also do not have access to and cannot afford the medications for chronic disease or even afford the follow-up tests that they need. And in Egypt, we also don't have universal health coverage. So this is one of the inequalities that I'm seeing because their chronic illnesses are exacerbated. But at the same time, as a youth advocate within IFMSA, and we work and represent more than 1 million medical students around the world, we also see a different kind of injustice, which is the intergenerational injustice, because we try to advocate on a global level, but also on a national level with our countries, but yet we are not meaningfully involved in the decisions that are especially related to and impacting our environment. So this really poses intergenerational injustice because this is our future, yet we do not have a say in how it's going to look like.
Thanks. I mean, I think that's a really important issue, that question of intergenerational justice, and a lot of us as parents will come on to that. But firstly, just, Michelle, if I could come to you, because it's not just, of course, developing countries which are affected, but rich countries like the US and Australia have a lot of communities which are most affected. We know, for instance, that during extreme heat, it's the poorer communities and particularly the people who live alone or who are socially isolated who die in greatest numbers during a heat wave. In the US, which communities are most affected by the climate crisis, and what, if anything, is being done about it?
Sure. So here in the U.S., disadvantaged and vulnerable populations are coastal communities, certainly. They're people of color, women, low-income communities, which are adversely impacted. And one of the great challenges that they face, while they're the reason that they're the hardest hit, is they really don't have the resources to adapt to what they're faced with. And that's true whether they're dealing with severe weather changes and coastal flooding. We certainly saw that following Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Harvey. But it's also true in this pandemic and infectious disease. We've seen that there's been a disproportionate impact to these vulnerable populations and communities that are disadvantaged. There's several strategies that are being implemented to try to address this, but I think that it's really imperative that we integrate specific attention to these vulnerable populations to really be effective. So industry, I think, can play a great role in this, for example, certainly with corporate social responsibility, which is, one of the reasons we're so excited to be participating in this forum today. We know that there's a business approach which can be taken, which will deliver with an intent to support sustainable development for economic, social, and environmental entities, so that all stakeholders are benefit from this approach.
Okay, thanks, Michelle. And Courtney, could I just ask you, in terms of, I know you have a lot of Indigenous patients in those communities where you work, and are there specific issues in Canada, or do you think they're generic issues worldwide?
Well, What's been such a gift living here? I do work in a majority Indigenous place. It's my patients who helped me understand these connections. So Indigenous people are really the original practitioners of planetary health. And when I was originally going to Canadian Medical Association meetings and saying climate change is a health issue, and they weren't ready to hear that right then, I'd come back and I'd be thinking to myself, is it me? Like, I'm pretty sure the Lancet says that this is the biggest health threat of the 21st century. I would sit down next to an elder like Francois Paulette or Bessa Blondin, and they would say, keep going, doc. And so really, they've been some of my biggest supports and sources of inspiration in this. And certainly because they live so close to the land, people in this areas, a lot of their lean protein still comes from hunted game or from fish. Health Canada is already saying that there's food security impacts, certainly mental health impacts. One of the first places they were described was in Northern Labrador by Ashley Consuelo, when people are talking about basically solastalgia, which means feeling homesick when you're still at home because of the changes in the landscape, permafrost slumps, trees tipping over because their roots sort of lost their footing. And so I think that really we need to realize that, biodiversity is highest in areas that are managed by Indigenous people. And there's really a tremendous amount we can learn from them as well as from the impacts that they're already facing.
Yeah, okay, great. So now I'd like to pick up on the issue that Omnia raised, which was about intergenerational equity and the question of what we're handing over to our children. And Omnia, I'll ask you, but some of the things that young people say to me in Australia is that they're not only concerned about the scariness about the climate impacts, but the thing that really worries them is that leaders and governments' complete failure to acknowledge the scale of the problem and failure to act on it, that they, find quite frightening, because it's almost like there's no adults in charge. There's no one, stepping up and taking charge of that. As a young person, what's your perspective?
Yes, so for me, since I began advocating in the climate space, I've been seeing really prominently, A, the lack of urgency, B, the lack of engagement of us as youth, and the last one is the lack of education. So when it comes to engagement as youth, we really represent a unique link between the communities and the civil society and governments. And yet our engagement in any conferences or consultations is not meaningful, nor is it sustainable in any way, even though we can give these policies the sense of urgency to be transformed, similar to what we're seeing now with COVID. And at the same time, I also see a lack of education. I'm a medical student now, seeing every day the impacts of climate change in the patients in my hospital. Yet I've never learned about climate change in my own curriculum, nor did 85% of medical schools around the world have. So there is also the need to have that kind of education in our own curriculum as healthcare professionals, but also as youth and students around the world.
Thanks, Omnia. So for the rest of us, with the exception of Omnia, all of us that are on the panel are parents, as are many health professionals. And we're very well aware of the fact that our actions, as Tim has said, in the next 5 or 10 years are going to determine the climate for decades to come, and our children won't have time to fix this, This is the climate crisis is happening on our watch. And so, Michelle, could I ask you, what's your experience as a parent, and how can we use that shared identity to connect with other parents?
Sure. So I have 4 daughters. They're 11, 12, 15, and 23. So there is a lot of conversation on this topic, and that's just every day in our house. But then I also fully am aware that there is a constant stream of information that they are on the receiving end for. And they are in real time hearing about these natural disasters, in real time hearing about the pandemic and other world events such as politics. So they've had a lot of emotions, really appropriate emotions, everything from anger and frustration and sadness and fear for their future. So I have, just to be totally transparent, I've struggled at times as a working mom to try to figure out how to support all of this, especially when we were isolated and in quarantine. And so things that we've done in our house is really just to remind them to stay connected to the earth, like get out there and hike. You can socially distance and do that. to do things to take care of themselves, meditation and yoga, but also most importantly, shared what I'm doing. I chair our humanitarian donation program at work and our medical education grants. And I've talked to them about, at Teleflex, we've been able to provide $1 million in grant support. And that's going to populations that really need that support. And I've encouraged them to also use the resources that are available to them. So I've got 3 vegans and a pescatarian now because they want to lessen their footprint. We are eliminating plastics. We're talking about good decision making as consumers. One of my daughters wrote an article around fast fashion and the impact of that. And then we're volunteering where we can.
Great, thanks, Michelle. And I'll come on to Tim in a minute, but just Courtney, I know that you've looked into some research around eco-anxiety in children and young people and what we can do. Can you tell us about that?
Thanks. Yeah, this is a really emerging topic. So when some co-authors and I looked at this just before the pandemic, one of them knew how to figure out how many searches had been done in Google, and it was going like this for eco-anxiety. Kids surveyed in the UK were really indicating huge levels of anxiety. And what's important when we consider that this is a threat that affects us all. So from a mental health perspective, we're sharing the same threat as our kids. And when we think about the emotions this brings up in us, things like anxiety, fear, worry, we need to have insight into our reaction because that is going to really affect our children. And so we talk about discussing this as a family. We talk about the necessity for self-care for each of us. So filling up our bucket with things like what was described, making sure you're appreciating the day, going for walks, etc. But what's really fascinating in the psychological literature is that action feels better than anxiety. So the very act of coming together, when you think about what a support group is like, immediately you're no longer lonely in your worry, which is one of the worst things people tell me about. Almost every time a year ago when I used to give presentations, someone would come up to me at the end and with tears in their eyes and say, I thought I was the only one who was this worried. People need to know it's totally normal to be worried. You are responding to an external threat. We can look at this as a cue, a constructive, unpleasant emotion that we need to change what we're doing. And so coming together is going to feel good. And that builds the civil society that we need to take productive action, because this is about changing the system. And there's further evidence that shows that having those wins is empowering and feels great. So the best part about this is that the best way to make us feel better is to solve the problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. Action feels better than anxiety. That's a really good one. And also the fact that, this is a lot of people have said, this is not anxiety, this is an appropriate response to the crisis that we're seeing, this is, you'd be worried if you weren't. And Tim, just finally, you wrote an article last year saying the gloves are off, talking about how climate deniers are, I think, predatory threat to our children. Can you tell us about that and your perspective on this?
Yeah, sure. Look, I rarely give myself the luxury of being angry because I've got to stay focused on creating change, But I remember watching some politician, climate skeptic on TV, and he was kind of enjoying it, poking at those who are concerned about climate change. And it just suddenly, I just found myself saying the words, stop threatening my children. And that's exactly what I felt. And it is very true that when you see those people who are acting in their own self-interest to destroy my children's future, it makes me every bit as angry as any other sort of predatory action that would concern my children. So I find that if I say that to people, sometimes it pulls them up and gets them to think at least a little bit about what they're saying and doing. But it is very true because their actions are holding back action at a critical time in a way that will destroy my children's future, at least the full potential of their future. And that's intolerable. We cannot have that.
And do you find that's a key motivator for a lot of people? Because if you really think about it, your key job as a parent is to, provide a safe environment and a safe future for your children. So it comes back to that fundamental responsibility, or what do you find?
Look, it feels very much that way to me, and I cannot understand people who don't get that. So we just need to shift our thinking and understand these future impacts. I think part of the problem is a lack of imagination, maybe. But now that we've seen the bushfires and we've seen the floods and we've seen the heat waves, surely people have enough imagination now to see that this is going to continue to get worse to the point where their children's lives will be compromised.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Forbes. There's a few minutes left for audience questions. I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, in fact, I haven't got any questions at the moment, and in the interest of time, we could roll on, given that there's all sorts of exciting stuff still to come, unless Kate, you wanted to dwell on anything.
That's fine. Over to you for conversation 3. Very exciting.
Okay, great. Thank you. So getting our own house in order, in other words, medicine and healthcare and nursing care and allied health and all of the good things that we do from day to day. What's our carbon footprint? Well, it's around 5% of the world's carbon emissions. And I was thinking about what Tim Flannery was just saying, and that's roughly similar to in between maybe all of Japan or all of Russia. And it's quite a significant amount. It's like saying, well, Japan doesn't need to worry or Russia doesn't need to worry. Well, they do need to worry, or we need to worry. We need to do things. So we're big contributors to the climate crisis, and coming from a base of first do no harm, that's a worry to many of us. We also spend a lot of money on procurement. We produce much physical waste. We use lots of single-use plastics, and we really do have a bit of a problem here. So I'd like to explore this a bit further with the team of panelists. Michelle, how do you see the role of healthcare businesses here? You're part of a global industry that provides good things for us. What's been happening in Teleflex heading towards environmental sustainability?
So I think there's a tremendous opportunity for MedTech to really partner with healthcare professionals on sustainability. That certainly wasn't something I fully appreciated when I was at the bedside, but in this role that I'm in today, I see that. Obviously, healthcare professionals are the end users of our products. So you have an incredible opportunity to direct how they're designed and developed and make sure that it's recognized how important sustainability is to you as the consumer of the products. So I think that is just one great example. It's often referenced as product stewardship, and it's basically taking responsibility for the entire life cycle of the product to really look at all ways in which you can minimize the negative impact it would have on the product. So at Teleflex, we are officially started our journey in corporate social responsibility, and all of our policies are being actively include product stewardship. So we are working to be compliant in that area. And we're also taking a hard look at where we can substitute materials that have been designated as hazardous or detrimental to the environment and look for safe alternatives.
Thank you. I think packaging of products themselves is also a significant issue. So not just the plastic device or metal device that you're using, but the packaging of it. What we roughly do know is that for all of healthcare, the interesting thing is that the direct energy use from our either coal or fossil gas-based heating and cooling, for example, of hospitals, there's actually a much bigger carbon footprint that comes from all of the stuff that we buy and the things that we throw away. And as an example with packaging, recently just in Australia, and I know there are similar activities going on in other hospitals, the Australian Packaging Covenant has looked at what we're going to do. And it's quite interesting. There's a plan for a 50% reduction of all packaging being used and a recycling of 50%. So it's quite a dramatic by 2025. And we, recently myself and a few others reached out to healthcare, to the group and sort of said, well, what about healthcare? And they said, yeah, sure. So as an example of where things are happening, Baxter, and I have no vested interest in Baxter, but Baxter Australia, New Zealand certainly been undertaking recycling of medical PVC plastic. It started at Western Health in Australia, and now we've got about 150 hospitals. I know Canada's involved in that as well now, and that's really exciting. So that's good to see what's happening there. I wonder, for example, Omnia, how does this all fit in a country such as Egypt, where I realise there might be very different difficulties with packaging, with recycling, with reducing and reusing equipment that is medical?
Yes. So in Egypt, I think the biggest barrier we face most when it comes to building sustainability within our healthcare facility is really the lack of awareness among the governance of hospitals and healthcare facilities. So the doctors are not aware, as well as the owners of the hospitals, as well as the government. It's not a priority. In Egypt, we have many other priorities, and climate change still does not really go into that area, as well as we also have in our healthcare facilities, especially with COVID, we have recognized how vulnerable and weak they are, and they really were not able to accommodate patients and provide basic healthcare services. And in my university's hospital, for example, which is the biggest, one of the biggest in Egypt, we still have a lack of basic equipment and materials. But at the same time, it's really, for me personally, I believe that investing in sustainable solutions, such as, for example, having LED lamps or autoclaves or heat reflecting paint, or these renewable and these green technologies in healthcare facilities, is a win-win case scenario, a no regrets investment, especially in a country like mine and other NMIC. But again, we need to have this change and this drive and this awareness among the health sector itself to take leadership and ensure environmental sustainability within the healthcare sector.
Thank you. Courtney, in Canada or elsewhere in North America, for example, are there any initiatives that represent practical reduce, reuse, recycle efforts, please?
Yeah, so I think some of the real benefit of this is for us to all move together. And I was talking to Andrea McNeil, who has done a lot of, she was the first person to carbon footprint the Canadian medical system. And so her big thing is to remember that the lowest carbon footprint test is the one you don't do. And so it wasn't conceived in an environmental vein, but we have a Choosing Wisely campaign that has identified a short list of things that we tend to do too much of, for instance, x-rays for lower back pain. And in fact, if we follow the rules and in fact just give the best care, that's efficient care, it's high value care because it doesn't waste our time and it doesn't waste patients' time. And really, it's also super low carbon. Other things that we can do are put a stop order on daily blood work in hospital. Reusing things is a huge opportunity. The infection control lobby, as you know, has really said, sort of struck fear into all of us in terms of reusing things. But really, that's how we got this far as humans. And I was thinking about, things that I've seen done in lower middle income countries. And we used to actually wash our otoscope tips at the project I was on in Djibouti. So in some cases, lower middle income countries are way ahead of us here because they never moved to this super high waste, high turnover model that high income countries have ended up in. And so the Canadian Medical Association in last year's Lancet Countdown brief committed to trying to achieve net zero healthcare by 2050. And as we see similar commitments in the UK and elsewhere, that means that we can act as bulk buyers to influence industry to say, hey, this is the new norm, help us out here. We're not gonna buy your stuff unless you make it low carbon.
Thank you. You've really touched on a very important point there about infection prevention, infection control, protecting the planet, protecting the patient, and the default routinely being single use because it's seen as being safer. It is a really important area and one that's going to be an ongoing conversation. I think it's not something that can be sorted out very quickly, but will require ongoing commitment. And I think we need our sisters and brothers in infection prevention to be part of the story here, and for us to reach out to them and say, how can we work together? I'd just like to pick up on, you mentioned United Kingdom, so the National Health Service Sustainable Development Unit and certainly their National Health Service itself being the largest health system as a single body by itself in the world, has already reduced its carbon emissions by about 20% and saved in the order of pounds, about £1 billion. Earlier this month, it committed to being the first carbon zero health system in the world. And there's a long, you could easily find that, anyone out there in the web, it's a long, almost 80-page detailed, credible, quantified plan for setting out how they're going to achieve carbon neutrality by 2040. Courtney, I'll just come back to you briefly there. What does it really mean to be a zero carbon health system?
Well, I just want to say, so that commitment by the NHS is huge. And having spoken with Nick Watts, who's been put in charge of it, he was my boss at the Lancet Countdown. That guy gets stuff done. So the fact that he is there with adequate resources, I think he said 28 people, with this mandate that comes from on high, we should all, Nick does what he says he's going to do. And so we should anticipate that that's where the ball is going, and we should do everything we can to run with him so we can all catch it together. And so I think that what we're aiming for is to make sure that the carbon we do end up using after we've, minimized everything, we can offset somewhere else. So we, it won't be that we're using 000 carbon, but we've taken it into account and are planting trees somewhere, what have you, to make sure that on the whole, we are doing no harm as we provide care.
Yes. Omnia, how do you think that might look, that approach in a country such as Egypt, that the English national health system has set out for?
I think this is very interesting because I was actually discussing the NHS story with one of the doctors I was working with in my hospital, and they really saw how unbelievable it is and it doesn't make sense. But then when I was explaining to them how this really has a huge return on investment in the future, and if in Egypt, for example, we decided to do that, that return of investment can then be allocated to provide better healthcare services, especially to those who cannot afford it. And in Egypt, we actually passed last year the Universal Health Coverage Bill. So this transition to carbon neutrality can actually help us implement and provide quality healthcare services for everyone, and to actually have a strong healthcare system like the NHS that provides healthcare for all. So after explaining this to the doctor, he felt a bit more convinced and thinking, okay, this is something we might think of in the future. And we hope that this can be part of the sustainability movement that Egypt is going to start.
One conversation at a time, yeah. That's great, that's great. Michelle, tell us in the US, how are things happening there? I know that it may be more on a state-based approach, but that's all equally important. I certainly know some exciting things happening in various parts of the country. Perhaps fill us in, you're based in Boston.
I am, absolutely. So I'm most familiar with what's happening actually across the med tech industry as it relates to some of the mandates around sustainability disclosures that we are seeing the rise in, that is actually guiding not even just med tech, but really all of industry in a way, I'd say, that has really been emphasized, and interestingly, even more so coming out of the pandemic. I mean, we are constantly seeing headlines around, the importance of having diverse teams addressing this, making sure that, recently I read a study, for example, that sustainability disclosures in industries gone up for S&P 500 companies from 20% in 2011 to 86% in 2018. So it is something that I'd say the public is more concerned about, but as well as the analyst community. And it's increasingly becoming an expectation across all of industry, in a way in which you basically, if you don't participate, you're not going to be able to differentiate yourself. It's the direction things are moving here, and that's very palpable.
Mm. Courtney, just on the infection control and prevention issue, how do you see this unfolding, and what would be the best way to approach the issue of the inherent natural tension between trying to protect the patient from healthcare-related infections? I mean, I could see conniptions occurring, as you described, the reuse of the earpiece. in a hospital in Australia. I could see people falling on the floor. What do you think could be an approach there?
I think this has to do with evidence and relationships. So we need to do the studies to say, you know, if you take that otoscope tip and you wash it in soapy stuff and you rinse it off and you stick it over there, do people get more external otitis than if you use the new one? That's a study a resident could run.
Yeah.
You know, that is not a complicated study. We can do that. We publish it. Now there's evidence. We need to do that on every single item. So then there's evidence. And then we need to make sure everybody knows what the evidence is. And we need to create those relationships with, as you said, our colleagues in infection control. Andrea McNeil, as you know, is a miracle in terms of getting things done. And she is so good because she's really, really good at reaching out to people and learning what the barriers to action are for them, establishing common understanding. And so much of this has to do with just really, really personal networks and getting things done, and also establishing what I think we have to do. We have the opportunity to do as a result of initiatives like Coda, like the Global Climate and Health Alliance, is to establish those international norms real quick. So instead of having, you know, that 10-year sort of trickle down effect that we always talk about in medical education, not 10 months, do it, you know, do the study. Let's make sure everybody knows it, move on.
The other issue, of course, is this, the great hulking mass of pandemic, the COVID-19. I dress every day in mountains of oil and plastic. And that's just what you do, because that's about infection prevention, and both to myself and to preventing contamination of other patients and other healthcare workers, for example. It's an ongoing discussion. I have never used a reusable gown, for example. They just don't seem to exist in Australia for the purposes of infection prevention. And that in itself has its own issues and worries and difficulties. But I wonder if anyone, Omnia or Michelle or Courtney, have you ever seen a reusable gown for the purposes of infection prevention? Certainly we have them in theatre, but that's just an interesting example of where we've got this disconnect. There is a profound disconnect that we need to work on.
I haven't seen them,
Yeah.
but not anymore. So the ones I have in my head are ones that I saw as a medical student. And then, you know, the drapes were washable when I was a medical student. And then when I was a resident, everything got switched over. And so a lot of this has to do with returning to practices that we had. And if we're washing those in hot water that's produced with electricity that's generated in a renewable way, we can expect that there's very likely a real lowering of footprint. And what I also like about it, as someone who lives 1,600 kilometers or 1,500 kilometers north of our major center, I think a lot about supply chains.
Resilience.
And I think we've had reason to think about supply chains. So if we're reusing things locally, we have to worry a lot less about disruption to PPE supply as a result of needing to cross international borders, which we're likely to see more of as the climate crisis progresses.
Kate, do you have any questions for us, please?
Yeah, Forbes, there's a few questions coming in. I mean, there's a few actually about the NHS, and perhaps just if I could just ask perhaps Courtney, can you just tell us a little bit more about, you know, Forbes has alluded to a 70-page document setting out what they're going to do. Can you just sort of give us the highlights or the overview of that? Because it's not just about LED lights and solar panels. Well, certainly not in England, it's not all just about solar panels. So can you just give us an overview on that, please?
Well, and I know that Nick Watts has spent the last 6 months putting this together. And so really it has to do with taking a look at where the biggest sources of greenhouse gas emissions are and then decreasing them. And so as we know, supplies are a huge part of it. So sourcing them, and the NHS has already been auditing its carbon footprint, its water footprint, and the proportion, I believe it is, of things that it's been using that are reused as opposed to going to a landfill for 10 years. It has targets as part of the Climate Change Act in the UK. They set every 5 years a target that they have to meet, and the NHS has its own proportion of that. So when you're in the UK, they got stressed out about whether or not they're going to meet their next climate change target as a healthcare system. So they're so far ahead of the rest of us. So this has to do with us auditing our own practice, this, and making sure that we also have targets. So it has, for them, it has to do with like how clean is our electrical supply, making sure it's all as zero carbon as possible before we use it in the hospital. It has to make sure with doing as much reuse as we can. It has to make sure, making sure the buildings are as efficient as possible so that we're not losing heat through cracks. All of those things are part of the plan. But what I think is really important is the commitment, countrywide commitment and adequate resourcing with goals. We know that goal-directed action works in healthcare and it works in the climate emergency as well.
Yeah, thanks, Courtney. So there's a bunch of questions really asking, what, as healthcare professionals, what's the most important thing that we can do? What's the bang for our buck? So I might ask the whole panel that. And in this conversation, focusing more specifically on healthcare rather than perhaps broader actions. Is that okay? So Omnia, could I start with you?
Yes. So I think what's really important, and before we become the trusted messengers, we need to promote the message within ourselves, because what we are seeing and what I'm seeing among all the medical students that we work with, all of them say that maybe they care about climate change in their own country, but many of the medical students around them don't. And it's also the same case scenario with healthcare professionals. We really need to increase awareness among the health sector of how climate change is a health crisis and how they have a role, not just a duty towards their patient, but also a duty towards their community and towards the environment on which the health of their community and their patients depends on. So I think it's really important to build the capacity of the health workforce and the health sector so that they can lead by example, and then all the other sectors can follow. Because as we all say, that climate change is a health emergency, and we more than anyone understand the direct and the indirect health impacts of climate change that are now accelerating more than ever. So we have a duty towards promoting that kind of message, advocating for health. And now we also with COVID have the opportunity to advocate for our health and the health of the environment to be placed at the center of the post-pandemic recovery.
Thanks, Omnia. And Michelle, from your perspective?
Really, mine's pretty similar to Omnia's. I mean, every healthcare professional, if they showed up in their professional life with a commitment to advocating for products and a willingness to participate in a forum, whether that's decision making around purchasing, whether that's educating your peers, whether that's participating in the development of new products, to really be assured that the products being produced are going to have the minimal impact, negative impact on the environment, that renewable energy programs are part of the companies in which you do business. I feel like there's a tremendous opportunity to move the needle here.
Courtney?
Yeah, thanks. I have found that teams get built fastest when you give people a target. So I actually wrote a paper on this target-based change making for a healthy recovery. It was in the Lancet Planetary Health. But for the longest time, I was asking people to help, do rounds at your hospital. And then I had 2 people to talk to. And then I said, let's try to get the Canadian Medical Association to divest from fossil fuels. And all of a sudden, people's eyes lit up and everybody's strategizing. And then they had to learn the thing to know to make the argument. So when we think about how we teach medical students, the all problem-based learning, right? I think that model works best in this area. So that same paper, and as part of the Coda process, we're creating a list of different targets at what's called the micro level, so personal level, practice your own life, meso level, departmental, getting rid of anesthetic gases, et cetera, and larger levels, national, advocating for gas phase out, for coal power phase out. Really, it's that group-based work that gets people off the couch. And so I think moving from an information deficit model of change, which is I'm going to tell you things and then you're going to do something, to a hey, let's do this thing model of change is really the key change we need to make right now to get things done.
Tim Flannery, is there any, I know you don't work in the healthcare sector, but is there anything today that surprised you about the health sector's carbon footprint or what's going on, or any observations that you would make?
Oh, well, look, I'm not an expert, Kate, on the sector at all, but what I have heard is so much wisdom about how to move forward. And I would just add to that the healthcare workers have so much respect in the community. They're really our natural leaders. They have a natural authority. And here in this country, we saw in March, when the COVID pandemic was really reaching a peak and the number of infections was doubling every 4 days, our Chief Medical Officer briefed the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister called a pandemic 2 weeks before the WHO did, and enacted a whole series of very difficult decisions, economically impactful decisions. So if the healthcare sector can leverage that trust and authority they have in ways that Courtney and others have talked about, I think it will be a huge contribution.
Can I just follow up on that? As you've just described, this really appropriate response to the evidence that was being presented to them for COVID, but we haven't seen the same thing from the government, at least in this country, on climate change. Why do you think that is?
Oh, look, I don't have a good answer for that. I think there's probably 25 climate skeptics in the government who are holding the entire nation to ransom. But why that is and how it's funded and done, I don't know.
Courtney or Michelle, do you have a perspective on that issue? Why did we have such an appropriate response in so many cases on COVID, but not the same on the climate crisis?
Well, I think that when COVID first arrived, Tim's right. There was no anti-COVID lobby, especially initially. And then we also have this structure within governments where our chief medical officers of health have a legal role and a legal advisory role. We don't have that with climate change in the same way in most countries. The UK probably comes closest. And so, and what's difficult is that what public health docs tell me is that they're under pressure. So say they get hired by a government that then wants to start a coal plant. Now they're like, oh, gee, coal's going to cause a lot of dust from air pollution. But if they say that, they're really worried they're going to get fired. And so that's one of the reasons why, even though this is a public health emergency, there's a huge need for clinicians to take action because we're a lot more independent. We have the freedom to speak in a way that public health doesn't.
Thanks. Michelle, is there anything that you wanted to add on that issue?
Just that, I agree certainly with what you just said, Courtney. People drive change. And I think what you just said about healthcare providers is really relevant. As a large multinational company, one of the things that we consider too is employee recruitment and retention. The next generation cares about the climate. They want to work in an organization that they feel like is making a difference. So there's a multitude of factors to consider here, but I think that is certainly one that is relevant to all of this in terms of what is going to actually reshape the way we, as corporations, we approach things, and what makes the environment so a particular focal area for us now in a way that we haven't seen before.
Thanks, Michelle. Sorry, Forbes, I've held you up. I'll let you move on to conversation 4.
Thanks, Kate. So in a way, it's fine because we've actually covered some of the areas of action, and that's really important as well. I've seen a lot of questions coming through, which is great. Here we acknowledge that it's a pretty anxiety-provoking discussion, but that action is the antidote for that. I think we've seen already some good discussions about what we can do, but maybe I will actually reflect and go through again with the team of panelists what you might do, and I might say also what I might do, because I think personally that so some of the questions have been asking about what's more important, work or home. Well, sadly, with apologies to my better half, work does matter more than home, because we use so much. So, for example, a 300-bed hospital in Australia is about 5,000 to 10,000 houses worth of energy. It's a monster, and that's just the energy. That's direct energy. And so, as an example of some of the things we've done, like we were able to rationalise the use of our steam sterilisers. So we switched off a steam steriliser, and that actually turned off 10 houses. Each load of a steam steriliser uses about the same as an entire house per day, of everything in the house, all the stuff you use for electricity, all the gas you use. So it actually really does matter. We put on 300 kilowatts of solar panels on the appropriately labelled Sunshine Hospital. These things really do matter. They make a big difference. And I've really been involved in these sorts of simple things involving teams over the last, goodness knows, 15 years now. And so I think all these things at work really, really do matter. I think the other important point is joining groups. And I'll say that, in Australia, Doctors for the Environment Australia, DEA, the Climate and Health Alliance, Climate Health Association, Global Green and Healthy Hospitals. There's a lot of groups within each country. I'm sure that Omni will be able to tell us about Egypt, and Michelle for the US, and Courtney for Canada. But I think those groups are also really important, because otherwise, I mean, often I'm feeling so anxious, I feel alone, but I feel much less alone if I'm with a team. Tim, yes, we are in a mess, but we have a chance to save ourselves. And looking in, could you maybe refresh what should we be doing? What little advice do you have for us further from what you've already discussed?
Sure, Forbes. Look, the good news is that this is a solvable problem, and solvable in relatively short order. And I think the COVID pandemic has shown us the steps that need to be taken to solve the climate problem. So the first thing you have to do in both the case of the pandemic and the climate problem is stop the problem growing. And we've done that globally in the pandemic case by social isolation and changing of rules and so forth. With climate change, it's really simple. You just got to stop burning the fossil fuels. If we can decrease our burning of fossil fuels by 10% a year, we can do it. And the thing is, solar and wind are now the cheapest form of energy over most of the planet. So it's not even as if it's going to be a costly exercise. We're taking an economically logical option to do this. So there's studies in Australia which have shown that we can transition from currently 60% coal to almost zero coal in 3 years with the appropriate investment. We can do this, we know that. We then have to create an emergency room, because there's a lot of damage which has already occurred, and there's more damage coming down the pipeline. And that emergency capacity really concerns our health system, but it also concerns our natural systems. So in Australia, what can we do to help the prospects of the Great Barrier Reef? It may cease existing at 2 degrees of warming unless we can do something. So we need to think about adaptation. We need to think about how we can invest wisely to make sure that we minimise the impacts. So give us robustness and resilience in the face of inevitable change. Thirdly, we have to start the equivalent of a search for a vaccine. It's very expensive, the outcome is uncertain, but we have to do it. And in the climate terms, the search for a vaccine is a search for means of drawing CO2 out of the atmosphere and storing it, because there's already too much there. So we can do that by protecting our forests, by regrowing our forests, letting nature heal in a way that draws CO2 out of the air and puts it into plants and into soils and so forth. We can use the ocean similarly with seaweed to do the same sort of thing. So giving the planet a chance to heal is really the vaccine. So we know those steps. We know we can do them. What we lack at the moment is willpower. We lack a united will to do it. If we had that united will, I can guarantee you that this problem would start abating very quickly.
Thank you very much, Tim. Omnia, could you perhaps even give us one success in Egypt and what your advice might be?
Yes, sure. So in Egypt, I think it's good, and it's also, good news for us that all the action that I'm seeing in Egypt in terms of climate change are all youth-led. This year I had the opportunity to speak in the first ever youth-led climate change conference. It was in January, and it was the first time for it to be held in Egypt among youth to discuss the impacts of climate change, both not just the health, but also the socio-economic, because it had not just health students, but students from all the different kinds of universities. And this really inspired me, especially when I'm working in pharmacy. We've been really advocating for integrating climate change in the medical curriculum. And because of the survey that I mentioned at the beginning, and we discovered this gap that only 15% mention climate change in 118 countries. And this inspired us to develop a curriculum for medical schools to integrate. And I was also talking with my public health professor about the possibility of that, and they were actually very open to it. So this is a dream of mine, and I hope it would be a future success story that in my university they will be teaching climate change, even if it's just a small lecture, but it is a dream that I hope I and all medical students around the world can see happening.
Thank you. Michelle.
It's a great story. So I think it's really important to celebrate our successes when we have them. We have a rather large portfolio and we are early on our CSR journey, but one success that I wanted to share that we're really proud of is in our interventional urology business, which we are striving to be a leader in BPH care. we invested in a holistically considered design enhancements to improve our environmental footprint. We were able to reduce the amount of device and associated packaging that is disposed of following the procedure. The actual volume of packaged materials consumed in the average case, we were able to decrease by 48%. There was a reduction in the PETG vacuum form plastic and paperboard used in the packaging of 38% and 23% respectively. This also led to some additional positive environmental impact by lessening the transportation to customers, reducing our carbon footprint. It's one step, but we'll keep taking steps, and that is our commitment. So that's one success I wanted to share.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And Courtney.
Thanks. Yeah, something we're really proud of here in Canada is the role of health professionals in the Canadian coal power phase out efforts. So in Ontario, about 15 years ago now, essentially health professionals joined forces with community groups to really make clear the number of kids that were going to hospitals every year with asthma exacerbations as a result of the air pollution from coal plants. That effort resulted in a commitment to phase out coal in Ontario that was accomplished. I think it was in about 2014. And so that was the largest decrease in greenhouse gas emissions from any single policy anywhere in North America. That was leveraged with similar people to a commitment to phase out coal in Alberta, which is our most conservative province. We have stereotypes about people. Nobody wants their kids in the emergency department with asthma. And so that was, again, health professional messengers. And then later for a national commitment to coal phase out. And because health professionals in the UK were doing similar things, that allowed Canada and the UK to co-found the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which is now a group of countries every year more sign on that say, hey, we too want to phase out coal to protect health. And so those are really, it's an illustration of the power of health messengers and calling to the best in people, which is what we can do when we say, hey, let's protect our kids.
Thank you very much. Kate, do you want to ask some questions and then I could wrap up a bit after that?
Yeah, sure. So there's just a couple of questions, Tim, about sort of drawdown. You've talked about sort of natural-based solutions. Is there anything else on the table, or is that the way we should be going? Could you talk a bit more about that?
Look, there are a number of options. All of them have difficulties and all are at a fairly early stage. The natural-based solutions have the benefit that the power source is free. It's the sun and photosynthesis, and we can do it at some sort of scale. There are industrial processes as well that are quite promising, and some of them are good not just for drawdown and sequestration of carbon, but for substituting for fossil fuels. So as a company in British Columbia, for example, it makes an e-fuel out of carbon dioxide from the air, which you can use as a jet fuel in aircraft. So it's kind of that sort of stuff is really good. We can also use silicate rocks, which are a kind of rock that's quite common in the Earth's crust. As silicate rocks decompose, they capture CO2 from the atmosphere. And studies have shown that if we just use the off-cut rocks and ground up bits of rock from existing industries, we could be capturing 2 gigatons of CO2 a year using that and fertilising our fields, our farmlands. So there are a number of options. It's one of those issues where we're at very early stage. We need to get moving on it, and we need to create a market for those solutions, really, which is a carbon price.
And then I guess a lot of the other questions are about sort of the levers that we have. You talked a lot about it's really, we have the technology, we know what we need to do. It's just a matter of will and political will in some cases. What are the levers that we have? A few questions have been about client Earth, using legal sort of levers, economics, so divestment, and I might actually ask Courtney about that as well. Can we, use our influence in terms of our, financial power? And then are there independent science-based groups that we can support to combat the concentrated media power that has been talked about today? So what levers should we be using?
Look, all of those are really important, but another important lever is to target those people in government who are in the pocket of the fossil fuel lobby and oppose them. Last year I was part of a movement in electorate where we got rid of one of the worst climate sceptics in the Australian Federal Parliament and replaced her with a young woman who is very, very pro-action on climate change and widely supported by the community. She got 58% of the vote. And it just shows you these things are possible and the willingness is there in the community, but we have to get politically motivated and behind people who are willing to stand up and stand for election.
Okay, great. Courtney, what do you think are the most important levers that we should be using? Any of those that I've mentioned and others? Or others?
I think of this in terms of shifting our vision, shifting our money, and shifting power. A lot of the time we've been sold this thing, you know, this is about your consumer choices. This is about where money and power go. And so when we think about money, that's divestment. We know that the vast majority of fossil fuel reserves can't be dug up. And the world's fossil fuel companies, their stock market price varies with their reserves. So I divested from fossil fuels when my daughter was, 6 months old. I haven't lived to regret that because fossil fuel free funds are actually outperforming the ones that contain fossil fuels. And all of the predictions we're seeing going forward, whether it's from the International Energy Agency or other, say that that's going to still be a good move. So whether that's at the individual level, at the community level, at the organizational level, national health systems level, or medical associations, that's super important. And as Tim was saying, we need to shift influence. So how can we provide evidence-based influence? I keep coming back to this thing where 5 times as many meetings were held with fossil fuel lobbyists in Canada over about a 7-year period between federal decision makers as were held with NGOs. We can overwhelm that. We don't have the deep pockets of the fossil fuel industry, but we've got numbers, and we also have the truth and people's good intentions on our side. So ensuring evidence-based influence is key.
Thanks. Michelle or Omnia, is there anything that you would like to talk about in terms of levers and influence? Sorry, that was Michelle.
Sorry, just following on that same theme around evidence-based influence, there's opportunities again to receive support for research support through corporate social responsibility. That is a domain in which industry contributes. So I'm not sure if all researchers out there are aware of that, but certainly there are resources that you can tap into to support this work, and it would also benefit the industry because it would allow them to show their support in this domain, and there's things such as ESG scores in which they're rated on this type of contribution. So just wanted to offer that as a resource.
Thanks. And Omni, I know that divestment has been quite a strong theme among a lot of students around the country. Is that something that you've been involved in, or what would be your thoughts there?
So for me in Egypt specifically, as I said, it wasn't really easy for us to introduce the idea of divestment because, again, we had a huge transition in terms of our economy, and it's difficult to talk about this kind of movement at this specific time in Egypt, and I know in many other countries within the Middle East region. But I've seen many medical students in IFMSA do that, especially in Canada and Australia. And they, in spite of the challenges that they face, I've also seen this kind of movement. And I really, for the first time, learned about it when I went with IFMSA to my first climate change conference in Poland, where I met youth from all over the world, and they were talking about divestment and coal phase out, and really asking the key decision makers that they're seeing in the UN climate change conference with the demonstrations and actions. And I actually did an action with Courtney and a group of the health community where we had banners inside the conference itself saying that the climate crisis is a health crisis, and each one of us held a health impact due to climate change, for example, heat stress or air pollution or cancer. And we did that right next to a side event that was hosted by a country talking about the idea of this natural gas. And we were really trying to highlight how this is not the solution, and this is a health crisis. So this is how I was involved in that on a global level. And I would really love to bring this to my country in Egypt. But for me, when I feel that there's more mobilization of youth in that. And one small thing, wanted to add in terms of research and evidence base, I really want to highlight the importance of involving youth in that kind of evidence and research, because we do a lot of activism, and with the right mentorship and the right guidance, we can really work collectively and co-create evidence in order to push for policies to be implemented.
Forbes, I'll hand back to you. I know that you're going to be wrapping up shortly, but and then the remaining questions are about what gives us hope. You know, what gives the panelists hope that we can get there.
Yeah, what gives us hope, I suppose, hope springs eternal. It keeps me going because you can all get rather depressed and anxious otherwise. But it was ever thus. So I think I've really enjoyed this. It's been fantastic. And I do want to say that it's been a really interesting series of conversations. I will point out that there are some really big topics here, and I think has come up in the questions, that there are whole topics in themselves, like population. I mean, that's a really important area to be discussing, you know, the world population. If there were 25 billion on the planet, well, we wouldn't be here. So I think those sorts of questions actually, as a call out to Roger Harris and the team from Coda to say this could be a whole other discussion down the track. And I think that that's really important because we shouldn't forget that that's part of the story. I think there are other points from the Coda expert team, including the panelists here and others, was how do we, what are some things we could be doing? I do think that in terms of energy, I think that we moving as quickly as some other sectors is really important. For example, the university sector in Australia is charging ahead, absolutely charging ahead of healthcare. And they're going to be carbon neutral well before we are. And that just seems quite ironic. So I think electrifying everything that we can, a good example, and I know this is local, but in Canberra, there's a new hospital going to be built that's going to be purely electric, no gas. So I think getting off gas as quickly as possible is really, really important. 100% renewable electricity, getting off gas. That's a big one that involves not just one person doing that, obviously. That's at the level of involving yourself with teams. I've mentioned some of the groups in the past. Find someone in your own country who's involved in this and working together to do that. I think there's also a lot of more local things that can be done. And I know that Courtney's already mentioned micro, meso and macro, as well as perhaps meta efforts. And I will say that these things are going to be followed up for the group that are listening in and others. There'll be ongoing discussion. We'll be adding to the story as we go along in future. I think a rapid reduction in what we call the super-pollutants is important, and this includes certain anaesthetic gases like desflurane and nitrous oxide. Having, knowing that that's tricky because at least in Australia, in some parts, many births are happening with mothers using nitrous oxide. But these are all things that can be worked on. Fluorocarbons for inhalers, as Kate and I were discussing, really, really important for GPs to be thinking about getting off the highly polluting greenhouse gases that are used as propellants for the standard asthma pump sort of things, getting onto dry ones. I think that nature-based solutions are really, really important. And these things, us as GPs and other doctors and nurses working, with patients to think of what are some environments that might make you less stressed. I know that Michelle mentioned dealing with stress with yoga and other sorts of mental health, benefiting ways is really, really important. I think that plant-based diets, introducing, imagine into our hospital that we just have, no meat Friday, for example. Those sorts of things could be really, really easy to do. And they're not that hard to do, but they actually are not happening necessarily at the moment. I think those sorts of things are going to be discussed. There's going to be lots of opportunity for the participants today and everyone listening in to think about how we can add to these micro, meso and macro sorts of goals that will come along in future. Kate, we know we're pretty close to the end of time here now. Would you like to wrap up with the finale? I certainly want to have a shout out to Lucy Timms and to Roger Harris, Ollie Fowler and the rest. You've been fantastic organising this Coda episode, and very much to the presenters who have all been just wonderful. Courtney, Omnia, Michelle and Tim. And Kate, would you like to have a finale finish by all means?
There is something I'd like to mention, if it's okay, because I think it's really exciting. Just a couple of weeks ago in The Lancet, an international intergenerational team published a new Hippocratic oath for the Anthropocene. And so when I think about what gives me hope, I'm thinking about this entire globe reframing their vision of health to planetary health. So I'll ask people to take a look at it, but the first line is, I solemnly pledge to dedicate my life to the service of humanity and to the protection of natural systems on which human health depends. And so I think so much of reducing the courage barrier depends on solidarity and depends on really the opportunity to say in front of our community, hey, this is what we're going to focus on. And so I'm so excited for all of the different times we're going to be able to say those words together in different fora around the world. I think this is the start of a new era in medicine and health.
That's all from me. And just to acknowledge Teleflex as a supporter today for supporting this educational event. Thanks, Forbes.